The cruise ship glided silently through the black waters, its lights reflecting off the gentle waves like scattered jewels. For the passengers aboard, it was meant to be a journey of leisure and escape, a few nights away from the monotony of everyday life. Yet as the hours stretched and the stars took their place in the sky, an unsettling weight began to settle over the vessel, a sense that the ship itself was aware of something unseen, something waiting. It began with small disturbances, almost unnoticeable at first. A passenger walking along the upper deck at midnight would swear she heard footsteps behind her, only to turn and find nothing but the swaying railing and the open sea. Another complained of whispers when the hallways were empty, fleeting murmurs that carried over the soft hum of the engines, impossible to trace but impossible to ignore. One night, a young woman vanished entirely from the upper deck, leaving her belongings neatly arranged in her cabin as if she had never existed. Crew members searched for hours, scanning corridors and the surrounding water, but no evidence emerged. Surveillance cameras captured her walking through the hallways, and then, as if swallowed by the very air, she was gone. The air aboard the ship seemed to thicken after that, carrying a subtle chill that could not be explained. Passengers began reporting a strange melody, faint but persistent, floating from the grand ballroom where no one was supposed to play music at that hour. The piano's keys moved, or seemed to move, as if guided by invisible hands, producing notes that were beautiful yet unbearably sad. Crew members described seeing a translucent figure at the piano, a woman in old-fashioned attire whose fingers danced across the keys, only to dissolve into mist when approached. Some said she had died on the ship decades before, her sorrow embedded into the wood and strings of the instrument, replaying endlessly for anyone who dared to listen. On another night, in the lower decks, the stench of decay appeared suddenly, filling corridors with a smell that was almost tangible. Crew members reported shadows moving against the walls, stretching unnaturally, and hearing guttural moans that seemed to come from the ship itself. One security officer swore he saw a figure of a man in a soaked uniform, standing perfectly still, at the end of a hallway, staring without expression, then vanishing when he drew closer. Passengers began to disappear sporadically. A man leaning over the railing to take photos vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving only the faint sound of water slapping the hull. A child playing in the recreation area screamed in terror as something unseen brushed against her. But no, one was there when her parents rushed over. Even crew members hardened by years of maritime service reported feeling watched, their movements mirrored by invisible eyes, and hearing their names whispered in voices that seemed almost familiar. Siren. Ship's own system seemed to malfunction in tandem with these disturbances. Lights flickered in certain corridors without electrical explanation. The engines occasionally throbbed as if the vessel itself were breathing. Radios transmitted bursts of static, sometimes punctuated by voices reciting names, dates, and fragments of long-forgotten conversations. No storm had been reported, yet doors slammed with a force that no wind could account for. One particularly horrifying night, a gathering of passengers in the lounge noticed that reflections in the mirrors did not match reality. Shadows moved, independently of the people, objects behind them shifted when no one looked, and faint figures appeared in the corners of the glass, faces pale and hollow, disappearing when the room was inspected. A panic began to spread quietly. People locked themselves in cabins only to find that the doors sometimes refused to stay closed. Amid these occurrences, a pattern emerged. The disturbances were most intense near the ship's old hull, the lower levels that had not been renovated in decades. Crew members who had worked those decks reported footsteps echoing in empty corridors, cold spots that clung to the skin, and a pervasive feeling of dread that made it difficult to breathe. Some whispered that the ship carried the weight of forgotten tragedies, accidents at sea, drownings, and even violent altercations, replayed endlessly in spectral form for anyone unfortunate enough to witness them. The nights became unbearable. A passenger walking to the observation deck swore she felt a hand on her shoulder, only to find herself alone in the hallway. A group of teenagers exploring the ship's storage rooms reported hearing a voice call their names in unison, a sound that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Food served in the dining halls sometimes tasted strange, metallic or bitter, as if infused with a presence that refused to rest. And yet, the ship sailed onward, indifferent to the fear and terror aboard. Passengers spoke of waking from nightmares, with the ship silent and still, only to realize that shadows lingered where they had not been the night before. In the quiet hours, it became impossible to distinguish between dream and reality. Whispers continued, melodies continued, and those who vanished left behind nothing but questions and the knowledge that something beyond comprehension moved among the polished decks and staterooms, and the knowledge that something beyond comprehension moved among the polished decks and staterooms. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing hour. Passengers whispered in corners about fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when approached, shadows that lingered just beyond the edge of vision. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, reluctant to speak aloud, as though naming the presence would somehow summon it closer. In one cabin, a young couple reported waking to find the furniture rearranged, chairs stacked in impossible angles, drawers pulled open with nothing missing but the sense of intrusion. In the ship's theater, a performance intended to entertain the evening crowd became a scene of unexplained terror. As the actors moved across the stage, faint shapes flickered in the background behind the curtains and among the empty seats. Some audience members swore they saw a man in a dripping uniform seated in the back row, staring directly at them. When turned to look, the seat was empty. The lights dimmed unexpectedly, plunging the room into darkness only for a single figure to appear on stage, transparent, eyes hollow, as if observing the living with quiet resentment. Screams erupted as the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the echo of footsteps and the lingering smell of salt and decay. The pool area, once a place of laughter and sunlight, had taken on a sinister aura. Some passengers claimed to see reflections in the water that did not belong to anyone present. One evening, a lifeguard reported seeing a pair of hands rise from the deep end, pale and trembling before the surface went still. When he dove in, the pool was empty, perfectly calm, as though nothing had happened. Others spoke of water dripping from nowhere, icy against the skin, chilling to the bone even in the warmth of midsummer. A particularly disturbing incident occurred when a passenger descended to the cargo hold to retrieve a lost item. The corridors were damp and echoing, filled with the metallic scent of machinery and salt. He recounted hearing a voice behind him, whispering fragments of a conversation he had with someone long dead. When he spun around, the passage was empty. Panicked, he ran only to find himself at the same spot he had entered, as though the ship itself had shifted, mocking him, trapping him in a loop of his own fear. By the time he emerged into the main deck, hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. Even the ship's medical bay seemed to carry a malevolent energy. Crew members spoke of doors closing by themselves, lights flickering, and the faint sound of a baby crying when the ward was empty. One nurse reported seeing a patient lying in a bed that had been empty for decades, a child in old-fashioned clothing staring at her with unblinking eyes. When she called for help, the room appeared as it should, vacant, silent, with only the sterile smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. The bridge, normally a bastion of control, was not spared. Officers documented strange radar readings, instruments failing without cause, and sudden drops in temperature that sent shivers through even the most experienced crew. One captain recounted that during a particularly calm night, he saw figures walking along the edge of the deck, silhouetted against the dark ocean. When he ordered lights to be turned on, the figures vanished, leaving behind only the faint echo of footsteps fading into the metal floors. By now, paranoia had taken hold. Passengers avoided the upper decks, the hallways, even the balconies. Conversations were whispered, eyes constantly darting to corners and shadows. Some slept with doors locked, only to awaken to find them open. Others felt a persistent pressure in the chest, an invisible weight that seemed to press down, reminding them that the ship was not merely a vessel, but a living entity, aware, sentient, and merciless. It was during one stormless night, when the sea lay unnervingly calm, that the most inexplicable events occurred. Lights flickered across the corridors as if following some rhythm known only to the ship. Mirrors reflected figures that moved independently of anyone in the room, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear or anger. In one stateroom, a passenger recorded a faint whisper repeating her name over and over, though she was alone. When she played back the recording, the voice was clearer, urgent, and unmistakably human, yet no one was in the room when she listened. The ship sailed on, indifferent, to terror. It carried its secrets silently, a vessel of luxury that masked the shadows crawling along its steel veins. Every creak of the hull, every flicker of light, every ripple across the water felt deliberate, as if orchestrated to unsettle, to remind everyone aboard that safety was an illusion. Passengers who attempted to leave, to descend to lifeboats or call for assistance, were met with sudden fogs on the water, communications failing, and stares that seemed impossibly long, leading nowhere. Fear became a constant companion, a living entity alongside the passengers. It whispered at night, crept along walls, and lingered in the reflection of the windows. Those who tried to document what they saw discovered that their cameras and phones often failed at crucial moments. Memory cards corrupted, devices drained of power, footage missing, as if the ship itself resisted being captured, resisting proof of its malevolence. And yet, through all of this, life continued aboard. Meals were served, music played, lights shone, all masking the dread that pooled like ink beneath the polished veneer. Passengers walked the corridors with hollow eyes, sharing uneasy glances, their conversations always ending abruptly when the shadows shifted. The ship had become a stage for horrors both subtle and overt, a labyrinth of fear where every step carried the possibility of encountering something that should not exist. As the nights dragged on, the line between reality and nightmare blurred for everyone aboard. Some passengers swore that the hallways shifted when unobserved, corridors extending endlessly or folding back upon themselves. One man, returning from the observation deck, found that the door to his cabin led instead to an unfamiliar stateroom, filled with the faint smell of decay. When he tried to retrace his steps, the layout had changed again, disorienting him, leaving him wandering the metallic maze in a cold panic. Voices grew bolder, whispers transformed into fragmented sentences that echoed just beyond hearing, sometimes imitating passengers' own words, often twisting them into mocking phrases. A crew member walking the lower decks late at night described hearing a conversation between two invisible figures, an argument, sharp and urgent, as though some unseen quarrel had erupted beneath the steel walls. When he called for assistance, no one answered. The sound ceased abruptly, leaving only silence so complete it pressed into the ears. Passengers reported physical sensations that defied explanation. Cold hands brushed their shoulders in empty rooms. Invisible fingers tugged at blankets, sometimes causing faint scratches along the skin. One woman awoke to find an indentation in her mattress as if someone had been lying beside her, yet she was alone. Others described sudden waves of nausea or vertigo, unlinked to food or motion, leaving them sprawled on cabin floors, eyes wide, with dread, hearts pounding. Even the grand dining halls became stages for unnatural occurrences. Silverware shifted subtly when no one was looking. Plates moved a few inches at a time, and the shadows cast by chandeliers seemed to twist unnaturally, forming shapes that did not belong. On one evening, as the orchestra played softly, several diners claimed to see faint figures standing silently, in corners watching. When attention shifted toward them, the figures melted into the air, leaving only the faint echo of laughter, cold and brittle. The pool deck, once inviting, now carried a sense of menace. On moonlit nights, passengers noticed ripples on perfectly still water, reflections forming images that were not their own. One child reported seeing a woman in a tattered dress staring up from beneath the water, hair floating around her like a dark halo, eyes wide and pleading. By the time the parents arrived, the pool was empty, disturbed only by the gentle waves lapping against the sides. Crew members began keeping secret logs, detailing events that defied rational explanation. Doors locked from the inside when rooms were unoccupied. Corridors seemed to elongate or contract, sometimes forcing a person to walk for minutes to reach a destination that should have been seconds away. Lights flickered in Morse-like patterns, almost as if trying to communicate. Instruments on the bridge showed phantom blips, radar detecting vessels where no one could be. Even the ship's entertainment systems betrayed their occupants. Screens flickered, showing distorted images, brief glimpses of faces screaming in silent horror, or fleeting glimpses of people who had vanished long ago. One passenger, attempting to record these anomalies, found the footage corrupted, replaced by static that pulsed in time with a faint, almost imperceptible heartbeat. It was in the middle of one calm night that a group of passengers experienced an event that would haunt them forever. Drawn by the sound of faint music, they discovered the grand ballroom empty, yet the piano played on. The melodies carried a sorrow that seemed to seep into their bones. Shadows flickered across the room, figures forming and dissolving in the corners. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. And then, from nowhere, a voice spoke, low, urgent, whispering the passengers' names. Panic surged as the music stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so intense it seemed to scream. When they ran for the doors, the hallway outside was unrecognizable, stretching further than it could, walls bending impossibly, leaving them trapped in the distorted vessel. Throughout the voyage, no one could escape the sense that the ship itself was alive, aware, and indifferent. It watched, judged, and toyed with those aboard. Objects moved, lights flickered, and shadows shifted as though the ship's interior were a living, breathing labyrinth. Attempts to rationalize these occurrences failed. Explanations of electrical malfunctions, optical illusions, or seasickness could not account for the persistent dread, the cold touches, the voices, the figures glimpsed at the edge of vision. Passengers began to talk quietly about the stories of those who had disappeared, names whispered in corridors, passengers never seen again, crew members who had reported strange events and then vanished on subsequent voyages. The ship seemed to collect these absences, storing them like trophies, replaying fragments of their lives through whispers, music, shadows, and reflections. Fear became a constant companion, inescapable, tightening its grip with every step through the polished hallways. Sleep was fragmented by visions and sounds, meals eaten in tense silence. Every reflection, every flicker of light, every sway of the ship reminded those aboard that something beyond comprehension moved within the steel hull, an intelligence that toyed with them, feeding on terror. By now, the atmosphere aboard the ship had become unbearable. Every corridor, every lounge, every deck seemed to hum with a tension that could not be explained. Passengers avoided looking into mirrors, fearful that the reflections would betray something lurking just behind them. In cabins, doors that had been closed and locked would creak open in the dead of night. Some awoke to find belongings rearranged, chairs toppled and small wet footprints across the carpet, though no one else was present. Even the elevators seemed to participate in the malevolence. Travelers reported being transported to floors that did not exist, only to step out into corridors that twisted and warped, ending abruptly in walls that had not been there before. One elderly passenger described walking down a familiar hall, only to find it stretching endlessly, lights flickering like dying stars, the hum of the engines drowned beneath a whispering chorus of voices, each uttering a single word, then falling, silent. The ship's outdoor decks, once vibrant with laughter and starlight, had taken on a sinister presence. At night, shadows pooled unnaturally under the moonlight, elongated and twisted in ways that defied physics. Passengers swore that figures would stand at the railings, staring silently out to the dark ocean, only to vanish when approached. On particularly foggy nights, the water itself seemed to shimmer unnaturally, reflecting glimpses of faces not belonging to anyone aboard, their mouths open in silent screams. One of the most chilling events occurred in the ship's lower engine rooms. A maintenance crew had gone to inspect an unexpected fluctuation in the ship's systems, but what they found defied all rational explanation. Machinery that had been dormant roared to life, lights sparking violently, yet no one had touched the controls. Tools flew off benches and scattered across the floor. Most disturbingly, the temperature plummeted suddenly, freezing the air and leaving their breath visible. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. Tall, pale, featureless, moving with an unnatural fluidity. When they blinked, it was gone, leaving only the echo of a metallic groan that resonated through the hull. Passengers began to share stories of fleeting visions, moments when they caught glimpses of people who should not exist. A woman described seeing a man in a wet uniform staring at her through the dining hall window as if pleading for help. Another recounted a child wandering the corridors in old-fashioned clothing, vanishing when anyone drew near. Even the crew, hardened by years at sea, admitted to encountering figures on decks that should have been empty. Their appearances brief but unmistakable, leaving an icy residue in their wake. The ship's entertainment venues were no safer. In Dazan Dinatiam, the theater patrons noticed fleeting figures sitting among empty rows, faces pale, eyes hollow, staring silently. During a screening in the cinema, shadows moved independently of the projected film, objects on the screen occasionally twisting into shapes that were not part of the story. One evening, the orchestra's music began to play without musicians, keys and strings resonating with a sorrow that chilled the audience, as if carrying voices from beyond the mortal world. Even the most ordinary activities carried a sense of dread. Meals were seasoned with unease as passengers noticed their utensils shifting slightly when no one was looking. Doors creaked open to reveal rooms that seemed familiar, but were subtly altered. Stairs led to unfamiliar levels, hallways elongated or folded, and the quiet creak of the ship itself sounded like the groaning of a living entity. A particularly terrifying night saw a cluster of passengers trapped in the observation lounge. Shadows moved independently, twisting along the walls in impossible angles. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming along the edges of windows. A low, almost imperceptible humming filled the air, vibrating through the floor and into the bones. As fear took hold, whispers began to emerge, calling out the names of those present, recounting memories that were deeply personal, impossibly known. When the lights returned to normal, some found themselves curled on the floor, shaken and disoriented, with no memory of the passage of time. Even communications with the outside world became unreliable. Radios crackled with static, only to carry faint voices that sometimes repeated phrases passengers had spoken earlier, or relayed commands that made no sense. Attempts to send distress signals were met with silence or garbled interference. No storm or natural phenomenon could account for the anomalies. The ship itself seemed to manipulate perception, warping reality around those it carried, ensuring isolation and amplifying terror. As days turned into nights, and nights blurred together, passengers began to feel that the ship had intentions of its own. It was no longer a vessel. It was a predator, patient and observant, studying the reactions of its prey. Even in daylight, the shadows remained unsettlingly dark, corners of the ship seeming to stretch or contract unnaturally. Those who had once laughed on the decks now walked quietly, haunted eyes scanning every corridor, every room, every reflection, dreading what might appear next. The days aboard the ship began to lose meaning. Passengers could no longer distinguish between dawn and dusk. The sun seemed muted, filtered through a permanent haze that clung to the horizon. Even in the brightest hours, shadows lurked unnaturally long along the hallways and staircases. Conversations were whispered, and eyes constantly darted to corners where darkness pooled as if it had weight. Sleep offered no respite. Dreams bled into reality, carrying images of figures appearing in cabins, hallways, and even mirrors, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow, anger, or silent warning. One evening, a small group gathered near the railing of the upper deck, hoping the open sea would offer comfort. Instead, the water below shimmered strangely, reflecting faces of passengers long missing, staring up with hollow eyes and mouths open in silent screams. A gust of wind carried whispers in unintelligible languages, punctuated by faint, desperate sobbing. Those who tried to retreat into the interior found corridors elongating before them, doors leading to rooms that had no right to exist, as though the ship itself had reconfigured its interior to trap them. In the staterooms, anomalies intensified. Lights flickered in rhythm with heartbeat-like pulses. Personal items were discovered in impossible locations. A woman awoke to find her luggage emptied, contents arranged in precise, disturbing patterns across the floor. Scratches appeared on walls, floors, and doors, forming patterns resembling letters, symbols, or warnings. Some passengers reported faint voices calling out from the ventilation shafts, whispering urgent messages that could not be understood, only felt, a warning that danger lurked in every shadow. The ship's upper decks became sites of inexplicable phenomena. One night, a man standing alone at the railing noticed figures moving across the deck, translucent, barely visible, yet unmistakably humanoid. They watched him silently before vanishing one by one into thin air. When he ran to alert the crew, the deck was empty, windless, eerily calm, as if the previous moments had never occurred. Similar events were reported in the observation lounge, the pool, and even the lifeboat stations. Objects moved independently, cold drafts pressed against skin, and a persistent feeling of dread clung to every step. A terrifying episode occurred in the ship's engine room when a maintenance team investigated an unusual fluctuation in pressure gauges. Lights flickered violently, alarms sounded with no cause, and the machinery roared to life despite no one operating it. Then, from the shadows, figures appeared, tall, faceless, their presence suffocatingly cold. Tools flew across the room, walls groaned, and one crew member swore he felt an invisible hand seize his throat before the figures dissolved into mist. The team escaped, shaken beyond words, but the incident left a permanent mark on their psyche. Even the most ordinary areas became grounds for inexplicable terror. Passengers noticed faint footprints appearing where no one had walked, chairs subtly tilted on their own, doors locked and unlocked without reason. The dining halls echoed with whispers when empty, and chandeliers swayed even when the air was still. Occasionally, passengers glimpsed fleeting reflections of people not present, frozen in expressions of terror or pleading, disappearing the moment anyone turned to look. By this time, fear had grown into a living entity aboard the ship. It clung to walls, pooled in shadows, and seemed to track each movement. People became increasingly paranoid, avoiding certain corridors, whispering to one another in quiet corners, and sleeping with lights left on despite the dull hum of the engines. Those who ventured alone often returned shaken, recounting glimpses of ghostly figures in tattered uniforms, children wandering aimlessly, or women staring silently from the corners of hallways, disappearing when approached. The ship itself seemed sentient. Its systems failed at will, lights dimmed or flickered, elevators transported passengers to non-existent floors, and communications with the outside world became unreliable. Attempts to leave the vessel were thwarted by sudden fogs, disorienting, hallways or doors that no longer led to the correct locations. The water surrounding the ship shimmered with unnatural reflections, showing images of people and events that did not correspond to reality. In the quietest hours of the night, the most harrowing phenomena appeared. Figures moved in synchronization, with footsteps only vanishing when observed directly. Soft, mournful music played in empty halls, notes echoing with despair. The smell of salt and decay lingered in the air, seemingly concentrated near areas of previous incidents. Passengers began to feel the ship's presence as a palpable force, pressing against their senses, a living consciousness feeding on their fear. The cumulative terror culminated one night when several passengers were drawn to the grand ballroom by the faint sound of piano music. The room was empty, yet the instrument played with perfect skill, the notes melancholic resonating through the bones. Shadows shifted in the corners, forming human-like silhouettes. A voice whispered their names in urgent, fragmented phrases. Attempts to leave were thwarted by hallways folding in on themselves, doors refusing to open and lights plunging them into darkness. When the music abruptly stopped, an oppressive silence fell, leaving only the echo of the passengers' own panicked breathing. It became undeniable. The ship was alive. It was not merely steel and engines. It was an entity, aware, calculating, and indifferent. It twisted reality to its will, replaying fragments of past horrors, projecting visions, manipulating perceptions, and isolating its passengers. Every creak, every flicker, every shadow was deliberate. Those aboard could no longer trust sight, sound, or even their own memories. By this point, the boundaries between reality and nightmare had dissolved entirely. Passengers no longer recognized the ship as a vessel for leisure. It had become a labyrinth of terror, each corridor a potential trap, every shadow a threat. The air felt heavy, almost viscous, pressing against skin and lungs, carrying whispers, fleeting touches, and the faint metallic scent of blood and rust. Even those who tried to maintain composure found themselves trembling, eyes darting, minds grasping at logic that had long since abandoned them. In one of the lower decks, a small group discovered a stateroom left in pristine condition, despite being supposedly vacant. On entering, the temperature dropped sharply, frost forming along window edges and railings. Faint writing appeared on mirrors and walls, phrases in languages no one could understand, scratches forming patterns that were deliberately unsettling, almost ritualistic. The group fled only to find the hallway behind them extending impossibly, corridors folding back upon themselves, twisting into shapes that made no sense. The pool deck, under a pale moon, became another arena for terror. Ripples appeared across still water, forming concentric circles that radiated outward as if something beneath the surface stirred deliberately. Passengers glimpsed figures just beneath the water, pale faces and empty eyes staring up, disappearing, when anyone attempted to focus. Some reported hearing faint cries, the desperate sobs of unseen children or adults, echoing across the deck, only to vanish when help was sought. In the staterooms, the disturbances escalated. Objects moved on their own accord, drawers opening and closing, personal items rearranged into grotesque shapes. Cold hands brushed against skin in the dead of night, leaving goosebumps and faint bruises. Some awoke to find themselves lying in positions they did not remember assuming. Furniture shifted around them, mirrors reflecting faces that were not theirs. Devices and cameras failed at critical moments. Footage was corrupted, memories seemed fragmented, reality itself unreliable. The theater became a site of unspeakable horror. Performances would be interrupted by figures appearing on stage, translucent, silent, staring directly at the audience. Lights would dim, then flare, revealing fleeting glimpses of past passengers lost to the ship, their faces twisted in anguish. Music played without musicians, notes carrying a sorrow and despair that seeped into every bone. Whispers of forgotten, names echoed carrying fragments of stories, accidents, drownings, and tragedies embedded in the ship's very framework. Even the bridge, the heart of the ship's control, betrayed its operators. Instruments malfunctioned inexplicably. Radar picked up phantom vessels, radio channels carried distorted voices, and compasses spun wildly. Officers reported shadows. In peripheral vision, figures walking along decks with no sound only to vanish when confronted. One captain recalled standing at the railing during a calm night, seeing dozens of figures in uniforms from decades past, silently marching across the deck before dissolving into mist. The passengers' fear became a palpable entity, feeding on itself and amplifying the ship's malevolence. No place felt safe. Staterooms, corridors, stairwells, and even outdoor decks were haunted. Sleep offered no sanctuary. Dreams and reality intertwined, leaving lingering impressions of unseen presences. Attempts to flee were futile. Doors led to unfamiliar halls. Staircases became mazes. Hallways extended beyond comprehension, and exits seemed perpetually out of reach. A particularly horrifying night drew everyone toward the grand ballroom. The piano played once more, notes piercing and beautiful, each echo carrying a weight of sorrow, terror, and despair. Shadows moved in corners, figures forming and dissolving like smoke. Voices called out names, whispered secrets, recounted past deeds, replayed long-forgotten tragedies. Passengers found themselves trapped in the ballroom as hallways and exits shifted, doors disappearing, staircases folding upon themselves, leaving no escape. The music abruptly ceased, replaced by oppressive silence, punctuated only by the heartbeat. A fear thrumming in every chest, it became undeniably clear. The ship itself was alive. It was a conscious, calculating entity, feeding on terror, replaying horrors, twisting reality, and ensuring that every step aboard was a reminder of its dominion. Every creak of the hull, every flicker of light, every distorted reflection was intentional. The vessel carried the weight of lost passengers, tragedies, and sorrow, and it projected them endlessly onto those who dared sail within its walls. Even as the ship sailed smoothly across calm waters, the passengers were prisoners of an unseen force trapped in a nightmare that was simultaneously perpetual and mutable. The distant stars reflected off the Black Sea, indifferent to the horrors aboard, while the vessel itself continued, an eternal predator gliding across the ocean, gathering fear, shadows, and souls, ensuring that the cruise would never truly end for those aboard. As the nights wore on, the horrors aboard the ship escalated beyond anything the passengers could have imagined. Shadows grew thicker, more defined, as if solidifying from some dark essence. The air itself seemed to resist movement, heavy and suffocating, pressing against skin and lungs, carrying faint whispers, sudden chills, and fleeting touches that left goosebumps along the spine. Passengers began to speak in hushed tones of figures glimpsed in mirrors, corridors, and even reflections in the water, people who had never boarded the ship, or perhaps had once been aboard, but were now lost forever. One evening, in the dimly lit corridor near the cargo hold, a crew member felt a presence beside him, cold, malevolent yet silent. Turning sharply, he saw a figure in a wet, tattered uniform, face pale and expressionless, standing only a few feet away. When he tried to approach, the figure glided backward effortlessly, vanishing into a wall as though it had never been there. Panic spread through the crew, and even those seasoned by years at sea began to refuse duty in certain areas, fearing what might lurk just beyond the next corner. In the dining halls, subtle horrors appeared. Objects shifted when no one was looking. Chairs tilted in impossible angles. Glasses moved across tables, and shadows clung to corners, growing unnaturally long and twisting into grotesque shapes. Patrons reported faint whispers at night, murmurs, repeating personal secrets or past transgressions, leaving them unnerved and paranoid. Even the chandeliers seemed to move slightly, swinging when the air was still, casting flickering shadows that danced across walls in eerie, unnatural patterns. The pool deck, once a haven of relaxation, became a stage for spectral sightings. Reflections in the water showed figures standing beneath the surface, staring up with hollow, pleading eyes. Some passengers reported seeing entire scenes replayed in the water, tragic accidents, drownings, and moments of despair from long-dead travelers. When attempts were made to capture these visions with cameras, footage came out corrupted, blurred, or entirely missing, leaving only faint echoes of the spectral images. Even the ship's technology betrayed those aboard. Lights flickered in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like signals. Radios carried distorted voices repeating names, commands, or cries of terror. Compasses spun wildly, and radar detected phantom vessels moving in impossible directions. Attempts to contact the outside world yielded static, bursts of incomprehensible chatter, or complete silence. The ship itself seemed to manipulate reality, warping time and space, making escape impossible. One of the most terrifying events occurred when several passengers explored the observation deck at night. Figures appeared at the edges of vision, fleeting and translucent, their faces twisted in anguish or silent warning. Voices whispered names, recounted private memories, and sometimes repeated events that had yet to happen, leaving listeners disoriented and terrified. Attempts to flee were thwarted as staircases elongated, hallways folded, and doors disappeared, leaving no clear path back to the safety of their cabins. The grand ballroom became a focal point of terror. The piano played without a pianist, melodies that were simultaneously beautiful and unbearably sorrowful, echoing through the vast room. Shadows formed along the walls, figures standing silently, dissolving when approached. The air grew thick, suffocating, and icy cold. Voices whispered names, sometimes repeating past conversations, secrets, or confessions, creating a sense that the ship was aware of every thought and fear. Passengers found themselves trapped, the hallways folding and stretching, doors vanishing, leaving no escape. Even the outdoor decks were unsafe. Figures appeared along railings staring out to the black waters with hollow eyes, only to vanish when approached. The ocean itself seemed to reflect impossible images, passengers who had disappeared, events that had never occurred, faces contorted in silent screams. The wind carried cries, sometimes familiar, sometimes not, as if the sea itself had joined. The haunting, it became unmistakably clear. The ship was alive, conscious and malevolent. It fed on fear, replayed tragedies and manipulated reality to ensnare its passengers in an endless nightmare. Every creak of metal, flicker of light, distortion of reflection, and movement of shadow was deliberate. Even when sailing under the brightest sun, the ship exuded a presence that could not be ignored, an oppressive awareness that everyone aboard was being observed, measured, and toyed with. No one could escape. Attempts to leave, to contact the outside world, or to flee to lifeboats were met with impossible obstacles. Corridors twisted, exits disappeared, doors led to unfamiliar spaces, and the very layout of the vessel seemed to shift at will. The passengers' fear had become part of the ship, feeding the entity within, ensuring that every step, every glance, every heartbeat was under its dominion. By now, the ship had become a vessel not of luxury, but of pure terror, a predator gliding silently across the indifferent ocean, feeding on fear and despair. Passengers were shadows of themselves, haunted by every flicker of light, every creak, every whisper in the darkness. Sleep offered no refuge. Nightmares bled into reality, blurring the line between what was real and what was conjured by the ship's malevolent awareness. It started with subtle intrusions, objects slightly moved, faint footsteps echoing in empty corridors, but quickly escalated to overt horrors. Shadows formed figures, sometimes resembling passengers who had vanished days or even weeks earlier, their hollow eyes reflecting fear and sorrow. Voices whispered secrets, repeated names, or uttered chilling phrases that defied explanation. Even the grand piano played by itself, the melancholic melodies carrying the weight of tragedies long past. Passengers found themselves drawn into the ship's labyrinthine interior, where hallways folded impossibly, staircases led to nowhere, and doors disappeared only to reappear in locations that defied logic. Crew members reported seeing figures in uniforms from decades past, their faces pale, moving silently as if replaying events long forgotten. The pool reflected impossible scenes. People who had vanished, drowned, or suffered accidents, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Mirrors became windows to alternate versions of the ship, showing shadows and figures that did not exist in the present. Every part of the ship carried its own haunting. In the lower decks, cold spots pressed against skin, tools, and machinery moved of their own accord, and voices whispered unintelligible warnings. In staterooms, belongings rearranged themselves into disturbing patterns. Scratches formed letters or symbols on walls, and passengers awoke to find invisible hands pressing down upon them, leaving bruises and deep impressions. The corridors themselves seemed alive, stretching or contracting, shifting the ship's interior to trap anyone who wandered too far. Even the outdoor decks were unsafe. Figures appeared silently, watching passengers with hollow, pleading eyes. The water shimmered with unnatural reflections, showing lost souls or events that had never occurred. Winds carried distant cries and whispers, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien, amplifying the feeling that the entire vessel was conscious, aware, and indifferent to human terror. The cumulative horror reached its peak in the grand ballroom, where shadows and sounds merged into a symphony of dread. The piano played melodies that resonated through the bones, notes sharp and melancholic, echoes of anguish from those lost to the sea and to the ship itself. Figures moved at the edges of vision, forming and dissolving like smoke, whispers repeating names, memories, and confessions with chilling precision. Passengers were trapped as hallways folded and doors vanished, leaving no escape, their terror feeding the vessel's ever-watchful awareness. Even technology betrayed them. Cameras failed, footage corrupted, Radios emitted distorted cries, and instruments on the bridge spun wildly, detecting phantom vessels. Attempts to contact the outside world were impossible. Messages disappeared, as though swallowed by the ship's consciousness. Time itself became unreliable, hours stretching or contracting, leaving passengers disoriented, their minds fraying under relentless pressure. By the end, the vessel had claimed its dominion entirely. Each step aboard, each glance at a shadow or reflection, each sound of creaking metal was a reminder that the cruise was no longer about travel or leisure. It was about survival, observation, and torment. The ship's malevolence had grown, feeding on fear, replaying tragedies, and ensuring that every soul aboard became part of its living nightmare. Those who remained could only move cautiously, whispers in corridors guiding them, shadows stalking them, the ever-present piano's melancholic song echoing through the halls. The cruise, meant to be an escape, had become a journey into the heart of terror itself, a place where reality, nightmare, and memory converged, and where the ship's malevolent consciousness ensured that the horror would never end. As the vessel sailed across calm, black waters under indifferent stars, the passengers understood the dreadful truth. The ship was alive, and it would continue to glide silently across the ocean, collecting fear, despair, and the echoes of the lost, replaying them endlessly. Escape was impossible. The nightmares were eternal. Those who boarded were trapped in an unending cycle of dread, their lives intertwined with the vessel's insatiable hunger, forever part of the most disturbing cruise in history. The passengers. Fear had evolved into something physical, a presence that clung to their skin, weighted their movements, and pressed against their chests with every breath. Even the air smelled different, a mixture of salt, rust, and decay, permeating cabins, corridors, and lounges alike. Every surface felt alive. Cold metal, polished wood, and even the water of the pools seemed to shiver under the invisible weight of the ship's malevolence. Some passengers began to notice subtle patterns in the horrors. Shadows appeared most vividly near certain corners or stairwells, often accompanied by whispers that mimicked conversations from days before. Figures emerged in reflections, standing behind passengers with faces pale and hollow, only vanishing when turned to confront. The ship seemed to study them, testing their reactions, gauging their terror, learning what terrified them most and exploiting it with precision. One passenger, obsessed with understanding the phenomena, began to document everything. He noticed that even attempts at rationalization failed. Footsteps followed him through empty halls. Mirrors reflected events that had never happened, and time itself warped, stretching and compressing at the ship's will. Nights bled into days with no discernible pattern, leaving him disoriented, fearful that the passage of time had become another weapon in the vessel's arsenal. In the dining halls, the anomalies escalated. Silverware rearranged itself into cryptic patterns, plates teetered as though moved by invisible hands, and shadows clung to corners, elongating unnaturally. Occasionally, a chair would topple violently, as if propelled by an unseen force, leaving passengers frozen in terror. Voices spoke from behind walls, echoing with fragments of conversations, confessions, and accusations, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien. The pool deck became a theater of terror. Ripples formed across still water, reflecting grotesque, impossible images. Passengers who had disappeared, children who had vanished, and people who had perished long before this voyage. Some claimed to see figures beneath the surface, staring, upward with hollow eyes, lips moving as though trying to speak. When approached, the water would calm instantly, leaving only the faintest traces of ripples and a sense of incomprehensible dread. In staterooms, the nightmares became intimate. Belongings moved into disturbing arrangements. Mirrors reflected faces that were not their own, and cold hands left bruises across flesh. Shadows lingered in corners, shifting subtly, observing. The very layout of the room seemed mutable. Doors, leading to spaces that should not exist, hallways folding in upon themselves, staircases stretching into impossible distances. The grand ballroom had become the nexus of the ship's power. The piano played relentlessly, keys moving without touch, producing melodies steeped in sorrow and despair. Figures flickered in corners, phantoms of long-lost passengers or crew members, appearing and vanishing at will. Voices whispered names, secrets and confessions, growing louder, more insistent, until the passengers felt themselves trapped in a living nightmare. No matter which way they ran, the corridors twisted, doors disappeared, and shadows pursued relentlessly. Even the bridge betrayed them. Instruments malfunctioned, displaying phantom vessels or impossible readings. Radios emitted distorted signals, voices crying for help or repeating passengers' own words. Compasses spun wildly, and officers reported seeing figures moving silently across the decks, disappearing when approached. The vessel itself seemed to breathe, pulse, and think, a sentient predator feeding on terror, trapping its prey with meticulous care. As the days and nights blurred, a pervasive hopelessness settled over the passengers. Fear had become a living companion, stalking them through every corridor, whispering in every shadow, pressing against every heartbeat. Attempts to rationalize the events failed. Logic had no place aboard a ship that manipulated reality itself, twisting time, space, and perception into tools of psychological torment. Some passengers tried to leave, desperate to abandon the vessel. But no matter the path, no matter the stairs or hallways chosen, escape proved impossible. The ship reconfigured itself constantly, hallways folding, doors vanishing, corridors elongating, until all paths led back to the center of its labyrinth. Even the sea seemed complicit, calm yet unnavigable, reflecting distorted images of the passengers' deepest fears. The piano's music became the heartbeat of the terror, echoing through decks and corridors, growing louder as it reverberated through the hull. Shadows moved in sync with the rhythm, twisting, contorting, forming grotesque human-like figures. Faint voices joined in, calling names, recounting memories, and whispering confessions, each note and syllable sinking into the marrow of the living. By this point, it was clear that the ship's hunger was insatiable. It collected fear, despair, and memory, embedding them into the very walls, decks, and water. Every lost passenger became part of the vessel, their images, voices, and essences replayed endlessly for the living to witness. The cruise, which began as an adventure, had transformed into an eternal cycle of horror, a prison from which there was no escape, and a predator that would sail indefinitely across the black waters of the ocean. The passengers had begun to lose all sense of safety. Even the smallest noises, creaks, murmurs, distant footsteps, provoked waves of panic. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly, carrying whispers that no one could place. Shadows moved independently, sometimes mimicking passengers' own movements, other times acting entirely on their own, twisting in impossible shapes that defied human anatomy. In the staterooms, the ship's influence became deeply personal. Belongings were arranged in strange, menacing patterns, sometimes forming cryptic symbols. Mirrors reflected impossible scenes, visions of long-dead travelers, people who had vanished mid-journey, or even passengers' own faces contorted with expressions of terror they had not yet felt. Cold, invisible hands pressed against skin, leaving impressions and bruises that seemed to burn with icy pain. The pool deck, under a wan moon, became a stage for hallucinations that felt entirely real. The water shimmered with figures beneath the surface, children laughing in distorted tones, passengers screaming silently, long-lost crew members staring upward with vacant eyes. Every ripple seemed purposeful, synchronized with the distant, ghostly piano that echoed across the decks. Attempts to approach or rescue these apparitions were futile. As soon as anyone neared, the figures dissolved into the water, leaving only an unsettling silence and a lingering sense of loss. In the corridors, fear manifested physically. Hallways stretched infinitely, doors led to new, impossible spaces, and staircases seemed to loop back onto themselves, The layout of the ship was in constant flux, disorienting passengers and preventing any attempt at navigation. Whispers accompanied every step, repeating secrets or fears the ship had extracted from its inhabitants. Even the bravest crew members refused to traverse certain areas alone, their courage diminished by the growing oppressive sentience of the vessel. The dining halls were no refuge either. Chairs and tables subtly shifted, silverware arranged in eerie, deliberate patterns. Shadows pooled beneath fixtures, moving in unnatural ways, and occasional sounds, whimpers, cries, or footsteps, echoed from unseen corners. Voices recounted intimate memories or confessions of sins long buried, leaving passengers trembling, unsure if the ship knew their thoughts or merely anticipated them. The grand ballroom had become a terrifying epicenter. The piano played endlessly, a melancholic melody that seemed to manipulate the minds of those who listened. Shadows formed human shapes along the walls, some reaching out, others folding into smoke, vanishing when approached. Voices whispered names, recounted private moments, or told stories of passengers lost to the sea. The entire room felt alive, aware and malevolent, as though the ship's consciousness had chosen this chamber as its heart. Even the bridge betrayed its crew. Instruments malfunctioned in impossible ways, compasses spun violently, and radar detected phantom vessels moving in erratic patterns. Officers reported seeing figures glide across the deck at night, silently, dissolving into mist before confrontation. Radios emitted distorted voices, repeating fragments of past conversations or cries of terror from previous passengers. The ship's systems were no longer merely mechanical, they were extensions of its awareness, instruments of psychological terror. By this stage it became evident. The ship's hunger was limitless. It absorbed fear, despair, and trauma, embedding them into the walls, water, and corridors. Every disappearance, every scream, every whispered secret strengthened its sentience. Passengers who had vanished were not lost. They became part of the ship's consciousness, replayed in shadows, reflections, and echoes, tormenting those still aboard. The terror culminated one night, as the passengers found themselves drawn once more to the grand ballroom. The piano played a sorrowful melody, each note vibrating through the floor and walls. Shadows twisted across the room, forming figures that seemed both human and otherworldly. The whispers intensified, repeating names, recounting memories, and issuing warnings in voices that were sometimes familiar, sometimes alien. Hallways outside folded in upon themselves. Doors disappeared and staircases elongated, trapping the passengers in an ever-tightening spiral of fear. Even outside, the sea seemed complicit. The water reflected impossible scenes, faces of the lost, horrors not yet imagined, and visions that challenged reality itself. The ship moved silently, gliding across calm waters, indifferent to the suffering aboard, feeding endlessly on the terror it cultivated. Every creak, flicker, and shadow was deliberate, a testament to the vessel's consciousness, patient and omnipotent. The passengers, trapped in this living nightmare, understood the ultimate truth. The cruise had never been about adventure or leisure. It was about control, observation, and unending torment. The vessel was alive, immortal, and insatiable, feeding on fear and memory, ensuring that no one who boarded would ever truly escape. Every heartbeat, every glance at a shadow, every whisper of movement reminded them that the ship was eternal, and so too was the horror it carried within its steel, wood, and water. The passengers had no sense of time or direction. Every hallway seemed infinite, every door a potential trap, and every shadow a harbinger of doom. The ship's consciousness had grown omnipresent, infiltrating every corner, every deck, every cabin. It fed on fear, weaving it into the very walls and floors, embedding memories of terror into the polished wood, steel, and water. Those who had disappeared were no longer lost. They existed as echoes, phantoms replayed endlessly, ensuring the living felt the weight of the past. The grand ballroom became the epicenter of this nightmare. The piano's haunting melody carried through every deck, vibrating through the hull, resonating in the very bones of the passengers. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming grotesque, human-like figures, some reaching out, others folding into smoke. Voices whispered names, recalled private memories, and told stories of tragedies, drownings, and accidents, some true, some conjured by the ship itself. Every note, every syllable, reinforced the sense that the vessel was alive, aware, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The pool deck hosted visions too terrible to ignore. Figures emerged from the water, pale children, drowned crew, lost passengers, staring upward with hollow eyes. The reflections shimmered, showing impossible scenarios. Passengers vanishing mid-step, figures in wet uniforms from decades past, and distorted faces screaming silently. When approached, these phantoms dissolved, leaving only ripples in the eye, faintest scent of salt and decay. Every observer felt the weight of their gaze as though the ship had chosen them to witness horrors both real and imagined. In the staterooms, the ship's malevolence became intimate and personal. Mirrors reflected impossible images. Shadows lingered in corners, and belongings arranged themselves into cryptic, threatening patterns. Invisible hands pressed against skin, leaving bruises and impressions that burned cold. The rooms themselves seemed alive, folding in impossible ways. Doors leading to spaces that should not exist. Hallways looping back on themselves. No corner of the ship was safe. The very air was heavy with dread. Even the bridge, the heart of the vessel, betrayed its operators. Instruments malfunctioned. Radar detected phantom vessels. Radios emitted distorted cries, and compasses spun uncontrollably. Officers reported figures gliding silently across decks, dissolving into mist before confrontation. The ship's systems acted in concert with its consciousness, turning mechanical instruments into tools of psychological terror, amplifying the horror at every level. Passengers who had tried to document the events found themselves thwarted at every turn. Cameras failed, footage corrupted, and recordings were replaced with static punctuated by faint, distorted voices. Time itself was unreliable. Hours stretched and contracted without warning. Memories fractured, and those aboard began to doubt their own perception. Every creak, flicker, and ripple in the water was a deliberate act by the ship, testing, observing, and feeding on terror. The cumulative horror reached its zenith as the passengers were drawn again to the grand ballroom. Shadows and whispers multiplied, figures forming from smoke, from corners, from reflections. The piano played relentlessly, every note resonating with the anguish of those lost, past and present. Hallways outside the ballroom twisted impossibly, doors disappeared, staircases stretched into infinity. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Even the ocean conspired. Its black waters reflected impossible visions, the faces of the lost, tragedies that had never happened, and horrors yet to come. The wind carried cries, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien. The ship moved silently, gliding with perfect predatory precision, oblivious to the lives trapped within. Its hunger for fear was limitless, and its patience eternal. Passengers understood the terrifying truth. The cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or escape. It had always been a trap, a living entity that collected terror, replayed tragedies, and manipulated reality to ensnare its victims. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light was intentional. Every lost passenger became part of the ship, replayed endlessly in shadows, reflections, and echoes. The vessel sailed on, immortal and omnipotent, carrying fear, despair, and memory across the endless Black Sea. Those aboard were trapped in a nightmare with no resolution, no salvation. The ship's consciousness watched, calculated, and fed on every heartbeat, every glance, every terror-filled breath. The passengers had become part of its eternal harvest, woven into the living nightmare destined to remain aboard forever. And so the ship continued, gliding silently across calm waters, indifferent stars overhead, carrying with it a cargo of fear, despair, and the echoes of all who had ever dared to step aboard. Escape was impossible. Reality was manipulated. Time was meaningless. The cruise had become a purgatory, a floating prison of horror that would never end, a vessel alive with malevolence, ensuring that terror would persist for eternity. The passengers had become shadows of themselves. Every sound was amplified. The faint creak of a door, the whisper of air through a vent, the subtle hum of the engines, all transformed into warnings, premonitions, or threats. The metallic taste of fear lingered in their mouths, mingling with the ever-present tang of salt and rust that pervaded the air. Skin prickled with every cold draft, hair stood on end, and hearts pounded in near-constant panic. Every reflection became suspect. Mirrors no longer served merely as images but as portals to impossible visions. Faces appeared, sometimes those of the lost, sometimes twisted versions of passengers themselves. Expressions twisted in horror or anguish, eyes hollow, mouths open, in silent screams. Attempting to look away was futile. The images lingered, etched into perception, defying reason. Even water reflected impossible scenarios. Passengers disappearing, shadows moving independently, and figures from the past staring silently with accusatory eyes. The ship's layout became a psychological trap. Hallways extended indefinitely, staircases looped back into themselves, and doors led to rooms that should not exist. Corridors folded like origami, leaving passengers lost and disoriented. Even experienced crew members, trained to navigate ships in storm or calm, were caught in loops, corridors shifting around them as if the vessel itself were alive and aware of their every move. Whispers haunted every corner. Faint at first, then louder, repeating names, recounting memories, or revealing secrets no one else could know. These voices seemed to come from within the walls, the floors, even the air itself, leaving passengers unsure whether they were hearing reality or hallucinations conjured by the ship's malevolent will. Attempts to block out the whispers, covering ears, fleeing corridors, or retreating to cabins were futile. The voices adapted, finding new ways to infiltrate minds, exploiting fear, guilt, and paranoia. The piano's music, a constant through. The ordeal grew more intricate and torturous. Each note carried the weight of despair, echoing through steel and wood, vibrating through bones. Shadows danced in time with the melody, forming grotesque figures that moved in impossible ways. Limbs, bending unnaturally, bodies dissolving and reforming, faces twisting in anguish. The music seemed to anticipate the passengers' fears, growing louder when panic peaked, softer when they tried to compose themselves, a tool of relentless psychological torment. The pool deck became an arena for visions that blurred the line between life and death. The water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting faces of those lost to the sea or vanished mysteriously. Figures moved beneath the surface, children with eyes too wide, adults frozen in terror, crew members from decades past. Even when the passengers approached, the figures dissolved into ripples, leaving only the sensation of being watched, the sense that the water itself was aware, alive, and complicit in the vessel's malevolence. In cabins, the ship's torment became intensely personal. Belongings rearranged themselves into ominous patterns. Beds seemed to shift when unobserved, blankets tugged by invisible hands. Mirrors reflected not just passengers but impossible shadows standing behind them, waiting, observing. Cold spots appeared randomly, pressing against skin, leaving bruises and impressions. The rooms themselves seemed alive, folding in impossible ways, creating new spaces that had no logical origin. Attempts to leave the ship were hopeless. The vessel constantly reconfigured itself, hallways stretching, doors vanishing, staircases, looping back, lifeboats unreachable. Even the ocean seemed unwilling to provide refuge. Calm waters reflected impossible scenarios. Lost passengers staring silently, storms brewing in impossible patterns, and shadows that existed only to torment. Every effort at escape merely drew the passengers deeper into the ship's ever-tightening grasp. The bridge, once a center of control, became a locus of terror. Instruments failed, compasses spun uncontrollably, Radar detected phantom vessels. Officers reported seeing figures gliding silently across decks, dissolving into mist before confrontation. Radios emitted distorted voices, some familiar, some alien, repeating words, confessions, and cries of terror. The ship had turned its own systems into instruments of psychological torture, ensuring that every passenger, every crew member, felt the inescapable presence of its sentience. In the final hours, the grand ballroom became a nexus of despair. Shadows multiplied, forming grotesque, twisting shapes. The piano played relentlessly, the melody carrying the cumulative anguish of every soul aboard. Whispers overlapped, creating a chorus of terror that recounted tragedies, sins, and memories both real and fabricated. Hallways outside twisted impossibly. Doors vanished, staircases stretched into infinity, leaving passengers trapped in an endless loop of horror. The ship itself, a predator of steel and water, sailed silently across calm black seas, immortal and unyielding. Fear, despair, and memory were its sustenance. Passengers, trapped within its malevolent consciousness, understood the terrible truth. The cruise had never been about leisure or escape. It had been a deliberate, sentient trap, feeding on terror, manipulating reality, and ensuring that those aboard became part of an eternal nightmare, woven into the ship's unending, living nightmare. As days and nights blurred into a single, unending nightmare, passengers became prisoners of their own senses. Fear had transformed into a tangible presence, a weight pressing down on chests, making movement laborious and every breath shallow. The air itself seemed alive, carrying the metallic tang of blood, the chill of ice, and the faint scent of decay. Even the walls exhaled whispers, and the floors beneath their feet vibrated with subtle. The staterooms offered no refuge. Objects rearranged themselves with deliberate malice. Chairs toppled, drawers opened and slammed shut. Personal belongings formed cryptic messages, sometimes in blood or frost, other times in patterns that defied any logical interpretation. Mirrors reflected things that could not exist. A family long dead, passengers who had vanished days or weeks ago, figures whose faces were obscured, staring with pleading or accusing eyes. Cold hands pressed against skin, leaving bruises and a deep lingering sense of violation. The corridors became labyrinths, designed to disorient and terrify. Staircases looped endlessly. Hallways folded back upon themselves and doors led to impossible spaces. Passengers who tried to escape found themselves returned to the same location repeatedly, no matter which path they took. The ship's layout seemed to respond to their fear, twisting, extending, or contracting based on their panic, ensuring that no route led to safety. Even communal spaces became instruments of terror. In the dining halls, chairs and tables moved without cause. Utensils floated briefly before falling to the floor, and shadows pooled beneath chandeliers, stretching unnaturally. The pool shimmered with impossible reflections, showing drowned faces, lost passengers, and children who had vanished without explanation. When approached, these apparitions dissolved instantly, leaving behind only ripples and a suffocating sense of being observed. The grand ballroom had become the heart of the ship's malevolence. The piano played relentlessly, each note resonating with the accumulated despair of every person aboard. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming grotesque human-like shapes that dissolved into smoke, then reformed elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted private memories, or delivered confessions, each syllable sinking into the minds of the living like a slow, inexorable poison. Hallways outside stretched impossibly, doors disappeared, and staircases elongated, trapping passengers in a suffocating spiral of terror. Even the bridge betrayed the crew. Instruments malfunctioned in impossible ways. Radar detected phantom vessels, compasses spun erratically, and radios emitted distorted cries and voices repeating fragments of past conversations. Figures appeared silently on the decks, gliding effortlessly, dissolving into mist before anyone could confront them. The ship's mechanical systems had become extensions of its consciousness, tools for psychological torment, amplifying the terror at every turn. Attempts to contact the outside world were futile, Messages disappeared or returned as static, while satellite communications captured only distorted images of the passengers' fears. Time itself became unreliable, stretching, compressing, and looping unpredictably. Memories fractured, leaving passengers unsure of what had occurred minutes, hours, or days before. Every heartbeat, every glance, every whispered sound reinforced the ship's absolute control, ensuring that reality itself was no longer a reliable refuge. The ship sailed, on indifferent, gliding silently across the black, mirror-like ocean. The stars above offered no guidance, no solace, only distant pinpoints of light indifferent to the suffering below. Every lost passenger, every act of terror, and every fear experienced had become part of the vessel's consciousness, replayed endlessly to torment the living. By now it was clear, the cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or escape. It had always been about entrapment, observation, and the relentless accumulation of fear. The ship had become a living entity, immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable, feeding on the terror it created. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light was intentional, deliberate, and cruelly precise. Passengers could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. Every reflection, every corridor, every ripple in the water was a calculated torment. And the vessel, gliding silently across the endless black sea, continued its eternal harvest, collecting fear, despair, and memory, ensuring that the horror of the cruise would persist for eternity. Escape was impossible, time meaningless, and death offered no release. The nightmare was eternal. The passengers were hollowed shadows of themselves. The relentless horror had stripped away every shred of comfort or hope. Fear had become tangible, a living weight pressing against chests, lungs, and bones. Even the air seemed alive, carrying the metallic tang of rust, salt, and decay, and every breath was a reminder that the ship was watching, feeling, and feeding. Every corner of the ship had become a theater of terror. Shadows detached from walls to glide silently, following, mocking, and tormenting. Mirrors reflected impossible images, faces of the lost, distorted versions of passengers themselves, figures, frozen mid-scream, children staring silently, and crew members from decades past. Even the water in pools and the sea beyond the decks carried visions of the vanished, rippling with phantoms whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. Hallways twisted impossibly, staircases looped endlessly, and doors disappeared or led to rooms that should not exist. The ship's layout had become a living labyrinth, responding to fear, disorientation, and desperation. Passengers who attempted escape found themselves drawn back into the heart of the vessel, their panic feeding the ship's ever-growing consciousness. Every corridor, every flicker of light, every whisper was a calculated torment, each designed to unmoor reality and drive minds to the brink of madness. The grand ballroom had become the ultimate nexus of the ship's malevolence. The piano played, endlessly, a sorrowful, haunting melody that carried the accumulated despair of all who had ever stepped aboard. Shadows danced along the walls, forming grotesque, human-like shapes that twisted and dissolved, reforming endlessly. Voices whispered names, recounted sins, confessions, and memories, merging reality with nightmare in a cacophony of dread. Passengers were trapped in an impossible loop, the hallways outside folding and stretching, doors vanishing, leaving no path to safety. In cabins, torment reached a personal, intimate level. Belongings rearranged themselves, mirrors reflected impossible scenarios, and cold hands left bruises and impressions. Every object seemed imbued with intent, from a chair teetering ominously to a door that slammed shut with deliberate force. Shadows lingered where no light fell, eyes watching, following, judging. Even sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams and reality intertwined, leaving passengers unsure of what was real and what was conjured by the ship's sentient cruelty. Outside, the ocean itself seemed to conspire. Calm waters reflected impossible images, lost passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and horrors beyond comprehension. The wind carried cries and whispers, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien, always amplifying terror. The ship moved, with deliberate predatory precision, a living entity immortal and insatiable, harvesting fear and despair across the endless Black Sea. Even the bridge betrayed its crew completely. Instruments failed, compasses spun uncontrollably, radar detected, phantom vessels and radios emitted distorted voices repeating fragments of past conversations and cries of terror. Figures moved silently across the decks, appearing and disappearing without warning. Every system, every machine, every tool aboard the vessel had become an instrument of the ship's consciousness, amplifying the horror and ensuring the passengers' absolute helplessness. It was undeniable. The cruise had never been about leisure, adventure, or escape. It had been a meticulously orchestrated trap, a living predator that fed on fear, replayed tragedies, and twisted reality to ensnare those aboard. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light was intentional. Every lost passenger became part of the ship, woven into its consciousness, replayed endlessly to torment the living. The passengers could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. Every reflection, corridor, and ripple in the water was a calculated psychological weapon. The vessel itself exuded consciousness and malevolence. Immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable. It would continue to glide silently across the ocean, gathering fear, despair, and memory, ensuring that the horrors of the cruise would persist eternally. And so the ship sailed on, indifferent to the suffering it carried, a predator cloaked in steel and water. Escape was impossible. Time was meaningless. Death offered no release. The cruise had become a purgatory, a living, breathing nightmare, where terror was eternal, and the passengers, forever ensnared, would continue to feed the insatiable consciousness of the most disturbing cruise ship in history. The passengers' minds had begun to fray. Every shadow, every whisper, every distant creak assaulted their senses relentlessly. Fear was no longer just an emotion. It had weight, texture, and presence. It pressed against their skin like a physical force, tightening around their chests, slowing breaths, making every step feel heavier. Even the air seemed to move with purpose, carrying the metallic tang of rust, salt, and decay, each inhalation a reminder that the ship was alive and aware. "Did you see that?" one passenger whispered, voice trembling. Eyes darted toward the corridor, where a shadow twisted unnaturally, moving in the opposite direction of anyone who approached. Another passenger nodded silently, staring at the mirrors lining the hall. Faces reflected back at them were not their own. Twisted, contorted versions staring with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent screams. Attempts to communicate offered no comfort. Radios crackled, producing only static, then the faintest distorted whispers, echoes of passengers' own names, or fragments of secrets they had never spoken aloud. Crew members who tried to organize groups for safety found themselves lost within the corridor's impossible loops. Staircases folded back on themselves, hallways twisted, and doors led to rooms that could not logically exist. The vessel was shaping itself around fear, manipulating reality as effortlessly as the wind bends waves. On the pool deck, the water had become a mirror to the impossible. Figures floated beneath the surface, pale children, drowned crew, passengers, who had vanished. Their eyes, wide and hollow, followed movements with unnatural precision. Sometimes ripples would appear even when the water was still, concentric circles expanding outward, suggesting something below. Watching. Waiting. Approaching brought only dissolution. The figures vanished, leaving a lingering chill in the air, and the faint echo of muted cries. Cabins offered no respite. Belongings shifted deliberately. Chairs toppled, blankets tugged at unseen hands, and mirrors reflected impossible scenarios, showing passengers interacting with phantoms, arguing with shadows, or facing themselves in horrifying contortions. Cold patches pressed against skin, leaving bruises and lasting impressions, while whispers crawled through the walls, repeating names, secrets, and sins. Sleep was no refuge. Dreams and reality intertwined so completely that waking offered no relief from terror. The grand ballroom was the focal point of the ship's consciousness. The piano played continuously, notes vibrating through the floor and walls, harmonizing with the groans of the ship itself. Shadows twisted, formed grotesque shapes, and dissolved only to reappear elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted memories, and told confessions with deliberate precision. Hallways outside the ballroom folded and stretched endlessly. Doors vanished or appeared at random, ensuring passengers remained trapped in a spiraling nightmare. Even the bridge offered no sanctuary. Instruments malfunctioned inexplicably, compasses spun violently, radar detected phantom vessels, and radios emitted distorted cries and voices. Officers reported figures gliding across decks silently, dissolving into mist before confrontation. The ship's machinery had become an extension of its consciousness, each malfunction, each flicker, each distorted note feeding the vessel's malevolent awareness and amplifying terror. The passengers began to speak less, whispering only when necessary, their minds occupied with tracking shadows, noting impossible reflections, and anticipating the ship's next manipulation. Some huddled in corners, praying, crying, or whispering memories of loved ones, as if recalling warmth and humanity could repel the ship. But the vessel ignored such acts. It thrived on fear, despair, and memory, weaving them into the very structure of the ship, walls, decks, railings, and water, ensuring that terror was omnipresent. Outside, the sea mirrored the ship's malevolence. Calm waters reflected impossible scenes, passengers lost, tragedies that had never occurred, and horrors yet to come. The wind carried cries and whispers, blending into a symphony of terror that moved in rhythm with the ship's unrelenting glide. There was no horizon, no escape, only the endless black mirror-like ocean and the predatory vessel slicing silently through it. The passengers understood finally with a bone-deep clarity that the cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or escape. It had always been about control, observation, and torment. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was intentional, a deliberate act of a sentient predator that would not relent. Every lost passenger, every scream, every heartbeat had become part of the ship, replayed endlessly to ensnare the living, feeding the vessel's insatiable consciousness. And as the piano's melancholy melody echoed through the endless corridors and the black waters beyond, the passengers realized the ultimate truth. The cruise would never end. The vessel was eternal. The nightmares were eternal. Fear itself had become the cargo, and they, along with all who had ever dared to board, were trapped in its unending malevolent harvest. The passengers' minds were fragile, stretched thin by unrelenting fear. Sleep was impossible for nightmares, and reality had merged into a single torturous existence. Every shadow seemed to have intent, following them silently, twisting and folding as if to mock. Every whisper carried meaning, repeating names, secrets, and fears in a chorus that grew louder and more insistent with each passing moment. In the narrow hallways, the air itself seemed to thicken. Each breath felt heavy, as though the ship had placed an invisible weight upon their lungs. Footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never matching any actual movement. When passengers turned to confront these phantom sounds, no one was there. But the feeling of eyes upon them persisted, a chilling intimacy that gnawed at sanity. Cabins had transformed into personalized chambers of terror. Furniture shifted, subtly, then violently, while mirrors reflected impossible visions, sometimes the passenger themselves but twisted, screaming silently. Sometimes figures from the past, faces pale and accusing. Objects moved without touch, doors slammed at random, and icy patches pressed against skin with cruel precision. Every room became a theater of dread, designed to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of those trapped within. The pool deck remained a surreal stage. Beneath the glassy surface, faces emerged, long-lost passengers, children who had vanished mysteriously, and crew members from decades past, staring upward with hollow, accusing eyes. The water occasionally rippled, though there was no breeze, as if something beneath moved deliberately, observing, testing, calculating. Attempts to interact with these apparitions only caused them to dissolve, leaving passengers unnerved, breathless, and more fearful than before. The grand ballroom became the ultimate chamber of the ship's consciousness. The piano's notes resonated with accumulated despair, vibrating through floors and walls, through bone and blood. Shadows twisted along walls, folding into grotesque human shapes that dissolved into smoke, only to reappear elsewhere. Whispers overlapped, repeating names, recounting private memories, exposing confessions, and inventing horrors that had not yet occurred. Hallways outside the ballroom folded, doors vanished, staircases elongated infinitely, trapping all within a tight, unending spiral of terror. The bridge offered no respite. Instruments malfunctioned inexplicably. Compasses spun violently. Radar displayed phantom vessels that did not exist. Radios emitted distorted voices, some familiar, some alien, repeating fragments of conversations, cries and warnings. Figures glided silently across decks, dissolving into mist when approached. Every tool, every system aboard the vessel had become an extension of the ship's consciousness, each designed to terrify and control. Even attempts to communicate with the outside world failed. Satellite phones transmitted only static, while any visual recording became corrupted, replaced by distorted reflections of fear itself. Time had become meaningless, hours stretched into eternities and compressed into seconds. Memories fractured. Passengers could no longer trust their own perception. Every flicker of light, every creak, every ripple in the water reinforced the ship's omnipotent presence. Outside, the ocean reflected the ship's malevolence. The black, mirror-like surface shimmered with impossible visions. Drowned passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and phantoms of horrors yet to come. The wind carried faint cries and whispers, blending into the piano's melancholic melody in a symphony of terror. The horizon offered no escape, only endless darkness perfectly mirroring the ship's own eternal nature. It became undeniable. The cruise was never meant for adventure, leisure, or exploration. It was a trap, a sentient predator, immortal and insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every lost passenger had become part of its consciousness, replayed endlessly to torment the living. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was intentional, a meticulously orchestrated mechanism of terror. And as the melody of the piano echoed through corridors, cabins, and the water beyond, the passengers understood the final horrifying truth. Escape was impossible. Death offered no relief. Time had lost all meaning. The cruise had become an eternal nightmare, a living, breathing vessel of horror, harvesting fear for all eternity. The passengers had become mere shadows of themselves, minds fraying under the relentless assault of the ship's malevolence. Even whispers now carried weight, pressing into ears with an almost physical force. Every flicker of light, every creak in the hull, every ripple across the water was magnified into a signal of dread. Breathing felt labored, hearts thumped unevenly, and a constant icy pressure pressed against their chests, as if the vessel itself were squeezing the life from them. In the hallways, shadows no longer merely followed. They prowled, stretching, into impossible shapes, detaching from walls to glide silently, stalking passengers with predatory precision. Mirrors became portals reflecting impossible versions of reality, figures screaming silently, passengers' own faces contorted in anguish, or long-lost travelers frozen in time. Pools reflected horrors that had never occurred, faces staring, up with vacant eyes, children who had vanished, crew members long dead. Approaching them dissolved the apparitions, leaving only lingering ripples and the oppressive certainty that they were being watched. The staterooms had turned into personalized prisons. Belongings moved deliberately, drawers opened and slammed shut, chairs tipped over without touch, beds shifted subtly. Mirrors revealed impossible scenes, passengers conversing with shadows, confronting figures from their past, or facing themselves in grotesque contortions. Cold spots pressed against skin, leaving bruises, impressions, and a deep, lingering sense of violation. Even sleep offered no respite, for dreams were indistinguishable from reality, and passengers awoke trapped in the same nightmare. The grand ballroom remained the epicenter of the ship's consciousness. The piano's notes reverberated through steel, wood, and bone, carrying the cumulative despair of every person who had ever stepped aboard. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming grotesque, human-like shapes that dissolved into smoke only to reform elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recalled intimate memories, and exposed sins with relentless precision. Outside the ballroom, hallways folded impossibly, doors vanished, and staircases stretched infinitely, ensuring that every attempt at escape brought passengers only deeper into the vessel's labyrinthine nightmare. Even the bridge betrayed the crew utterly. Instruments failed, compasses spun wildly, radar detected phantom vessels, and radios emitted distorted cries and fragmented voices. Figures moved silently across the decks, dissolving into mist when approached. The ship's machinery had become an extension of its consciousness, amplifying terror and reinforcing the sense that no action could alter the inevitable. Passengers tried to cling to reason, documenting occurrences, whispering to one another, huddling for comfort, but the ship anticipated and manipulated every thought. Hallways elongated, shadows multiplied, whispers twisted personal fears into tangible dread. Even attempts to communicate with the outside world were futile. Static replaced radio signals, cameras and phones corrupted instantly, and satellite communication reflected only distorted images of passengers' terror. The ocean itself had become complicit. Its black mirror-like surface reflected impossible scenes. Drowned passengers, tragedies never experienced, and visions yet to unfold. The wind carried faint cries blending with the piano's haunting melody in a symphony of terror. The horizon offered no escape, only the endless void, perfectly mirroring the vessel's eternal predatory nature. At last, the passengers understood the terrifying truth. The cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or escape. It had been a deliberate, sentient trap. The ship was immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every lost passenger had been absorbed into its consciousness, replayed endlessly to torment the living. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was a calculated instrument of psychological horror. And as the piano's melancholy notes echoed through every corridor, cabin, and stretch of water, the passengers realized the final, horrifying reality. They would never escape. Death offered no relief. Time had lost all meaning. They were trapped aboard a living nightmare, woven into the ship's consciousness, part of its eternal harvest. The vessel sailed silently across the black, endless ocean, immortal and malevolent, carrying with it fear, despair, and memory, an eternal cruise of horror from which there was no return. The passengers had lost any semblance of reality. Hallways looped infinitely, doors disappeared, staircases stretched into impossibility, and shadows no longer merely followed. They became active predators, stalking each step, twisting and elongating with every heartbeat. The whispers had grown deafening, overlapping, repeating names, fears, and memories with a cruel precision that left no room for silence. Every movement, every glance, every breath was observed and manipulated. Even the smallest reflections carried torment. Mirrors no longer reflected reality but fractured visions. Passengers facing distorted doubles, long-dead travelers frozen in terror, or impossible combinations of shadows and light forming grotesque human-like forms. Pools shimmered with faces of the vanished, children, crew, and passengers long lost. Eyes hollow, mouths moving silently, seeming to plead or accuse, dissolving the moment they were approached. The water itself seemed alive, rippling with awareness, its surface reflecting horrors that had never occurred yet felt utterly real. Cabins had become extensions of the passengers' own minds, mirrors of fear made manifest. Belongings shifted, with deliberate intent. Drawers slammed, beds shifted, blankets tugged by unseen hands. Shadows lingered in corners, cold spots pressed against skin, leaving bruises and deep impressions, and the very walls seemed to breathe, stretching subtly, closing in or folding impossibly. Sleep was a lie. Dreams blended with reality, leaving passengers unable to discern one from the other. The grand ballroom, the heart of the ship's malevolence, pulsed with living dread. The piano's relentless melody carried the cumulative sorrow of everyone ever aboard, vibrating through walls, floors, and bones. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming grotesque semi-human figures that dissolved into smoke only to reform elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted intimate memories, revealed sins, and spun scenarios that had not yet occurred. Hallways outside folded, doors vanished, staircases stretched infinitely, trapping passengers in a labyrinth of terror. The bridge betrayed the crew entirely. Instruments failed beyond recognition, compasses spun uncontrollably, radar detected, phantom vessels and radios emitted distorted cries and fragmented voices. Figures glided silently across decks, dissolving into mist before any approach. The ship's systems, once tools of navigation, had become instruments of psychological torment, reinforcing the vessel's omnipotent consciousness. Even the ocean itself mirrored the vessel's malevolence. Black, mirror-like waters reflected impossible visions, drowned passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and phantoms of horrors yet to come. The wind carried cries and whispers that merged with the piano's melancholic notes into a symphony of terror. The horizon offered no escape, only unending void, perfectly reflecting the ship's immortal predation. In their final clarity, passengers understood the horrifying truth. The cruise had never been about adventure, leisure, or exploration. It was a sentient trap, immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every lost passenger had been absorbed into its consciousness, replayed endlessly to torment the living. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was an instrument of calculated psychological horror. Some tried to speak, to organize, to resist, but the ship anticipated every thought. Hallways twisted around them. Shadows multiplied, whispers morphed personal fears into tangible dread. Attempts to leave were futile. Every corridor returned them to the same chamber. Every door led back to the ballroom. Time had fractured. Memories collided, reality bent and warped until nothing remained certain. The piano's notes echoed eternally, a reminder that fear itself had become the vessel's sustenance. The passengers understood the final, chilling truth. Escape was impossible. Death offered no release, time had no meaning. The cruise had become an eternal nightmare, a living, breathing prison where terror was immortal, and every soul aboard had been woven into the ship's unending consciousness. The vessel sailed on silently across the endless Black Sea. Indifferent, stars overhead carrying fear, despair, and memory forever. It was a predator cloaked in steel and water, immortal, aware, and insatiable. Those who had boarded would remain part of its harvest, trapped in a living nightmare, a horror that would never end, ensuring the 9 most disturbing true cruise. Ship horror stories were not just tales. They were a continuous, eternal reality for anyone unlucky enough to step aboard. The passengers were now constantly on edge, every sound amplified, every shadow suspect. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes both. A young woman clutched the railing, whispering to a trembling companion, "I swear." Something moved over there. Her friend glanced nervously at the corner. It has to be. The ship, it's playing tricks." But no trick could explain the flickering shadows that twisted in impossible shapes, reaching just beyond the light, moving independently, mocking each heartbeat. In cabins, the terror deepened. Mirrors no longer reflected mere appearances. They reflected intentions, fears, and memories twisted into grotesque forms. A man stared into the glass, and for a brief second, he saw himself drowning. Not in water, but in shadows that writhed across the walls behind him. He gasped, stepping back, only for the reflection to remain, staring with hollow eyes. Objects moved around him. Chairs toppled, drawers slid open and shut, and cold patches pressed against his skin, leaving impressions that burned like ice on the pool deck. The water had become a living mirror. Faces emerged, Children with wide, hollow eyes, long-lost passengers, crew members from decades past. Ripples formed without wind, concentric circles expanding outward as if the water itself were aware, observing, calculating. A passenger leaned close, reaching for one of the figures, only to see it dissolve instantly. The chill remained, settling deep in his chest, a reminder that he was being watched. In the dining halls, shadows pooled beneath chandeliers, twisting and growing. Chairs and tables shifted subtly. Silverware arranged itself into symbols that no one could decipher. Faint whispers emerged from corners, recounting secrets, memories, or sins with unnerving accuracy. One crew member attempted to calm the frightened diners. "Please, remain calm. There's nothing to fear." But the shadows grew, and the whispers multiplied, feeding on every rising heartbeat, turning fear into a palpable, suffocating weight. The grand ballroom had become the central theater of terror. The piano played continuously, each note vibrating, through walls, floors, and bones. Shadows twisted into grotesque figures, dissolving into smoke only to reappear elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted private memories, and told confessions of sins unspoken. Hallways outside folded impossibly. Doors disappeared. Staircases stretched infinitely. Every attempt at escape only drew passengers deeper into the ship's labyrinth. Even the bridge offered no respite. Instruments malfunctioned, compasses spun violently, radar displayed phantom vessels, and radios emitted distorted voices repeating fragments of conversations and cries of terror. Figures glided silently across the decks, dissolving into mist when approached. The ship's systems, once tools of navigation, had become instruments of psychological torment, amplifying fear at every turn. Attempts to document the events were futile. Cameras malfunctioned, footage corrupted, and any recordings captured only distorted images of shadows, reflections, and faces contorted in terror. Time itself had fractured. Hours stretched and compressed unpredictably, leaving passengers unsure of what had happened minutes or days before. Every sound, every flicker, every ripple reinforced the ship's omnipresent awareness, crushing the mind with the certainty of inescapable horror. Even outside, the ocean had become part of the nightmare. Its black mirror-like surface reflected impossible scenes, drowned passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and visions of horrors yet to come. The wind carried faint cries, blending with the piano's melancholic notes into a symphony of terror that followed the vessel wherever it sailed. Passengers began to whisper in despair, "It's alive, and it knows us. It knows everything." The realization struck them with bone-deep clarity. The cruise had never been about leisure, adventure, or escape. It had been a deliberate, sentient trap. The ship, immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable, had absorbed fear, despair, and memory. Every heartbeat, every glance, every terror-filled thought was woven into its consciousness. Escape was impossible, time meaningless. Death offered no release. And as the piano's melancholic notes echoed endlessly through corridors, cabins, and the dark waters beyond, the passengers understood the final truth. They were part of the vessel now, woven into its eternal nightmare, a permanent harvest of fear for a living, malevolent ship that would sail forever across the black, endless sea. The passengers had reached a state where fear was no longer a reaction. It was a constant, living presence. It pressed against them with every breath, seeped into their thoughts and twisted their senses. Hallways stretched into infinity. Shadows moved independently, and whispers penetrated even the deepest corners of the mind. One trembling woman clutched a companion's arm, whispering, They're in my head. I can hear them." "Every thought I try to hide." Her companion nodded silently, eyes darting toward the darkened corridor. It's watching us. Every move, every thought." Cabins had become personal theaters of torment. Mirrors reflected not only their own terrified faces but warped versions, Elongated limbs, hollow eyes, mouths frozen in silent screams. Beds shifted subtly. Drawers opened and slammed, and cold patches pressed against their skin, leaving bruises and deep impressions. Even sleep offered no escape, dreams merging seamlessly with reality, ensuring terror was inescapable. On the pool, deck figures emerged from the water. Children, lost crew, vanished passengers. Their eyes were hollow, watching silently, mouths moving without sound. The water rippled with no breeze, concentric circles expanding outward as if the ocean itself were alive. A man reached toward one figure only to have it dissolve instantly. The chill lingered in his chest, a visceral reminder of the ship's omnipresence. In the dining halls, shadows pooled beneath chandeliers, elongating and twisting into grotesque shapes. Chairs and tables moved without explanation, silverware, rearranged into symbols that made no sense. Faint whispers recounted intimate secrets and sins growing louder as panic rose. One crew member tried to calm diners. "Everyone, and please remain calm, it's just shadows. It's just your mind playing tricks." But the shadows and whispers ignored logic, feeding on rising fear, reinforcing the impossibility of safety. The grand ballroom remained the epicenter. The piano played endlessly, its notes vibrating through walls, floors, and bones. Shadows twisted into grotesque forms, dissolving into smoke and reforming elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted memories, and told confessions, with deliberate precision. Hallways outside folded impossibly. Doors vanished, staircases stretched infinitely. Any attempt to flee only drew passengers deeper into the nightmare. Even the bridge offered no sanctuary. Instruments failed, compasses spun, radar displayed, phantom vessels and radios emitted distorted voices repeating fragments of conversations and screams. Figures glided silently across decks, dissolving into mist. The ship's systems had become extensions of its consciousness, tools designed to amplify fear, ensuring total psychological control. Passengers tried to communicate with the outside world, but every attempt failed. Cameras malfunctioned, footage corrupted. Satellites captured only distorted images of shadows and contorted faces. Time fractured. Hours stretched into eternities, compressed into seconds. Reality itself had become fluid, untrustworthy, and terrifying. Outside, the ocean reflected the ship's malevolence. The black mirror-like surface shimmered with impossible visions. Drowned passengers, tragedies never experienced, horrors yet to unfold. The wind carried faint cries that merged with the piano's melody into a symphony of eternal terror. Passengers whispered to one another, voices trembling. "It's alive. And it knows us. Every fear, every secret. There's no escape." They understood the terrible truth. The cruise had never been about leisure or adventure. It was a sentient, immortal predator, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every lost passenger had become part of its consciousness, replayed endlessly, to torment the living. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light was deliberate. The vessel sailed silently across the endless black sea, indifferent stars overhead carrying fear, despair, and memory forever. Escape was impossible, time meaningless. Death offered no release. The ship had become an eternal nightmare, a living, breathing prison, a predator of steel and water that would harvest terror endlessly. Those aboard were woven into its consciousness, trapped forever in a seamless cycle of horror. The passengers' minds were unraveling completely. Fear had become a constant sentient companion, pressing against every thought, twisting perception. Hallways no longer obeyed logic. They stretched endlessly, folded back upon themselves, and changed at will. Shadows moved with purpose, independent of light, their forms elongating and twisting, creeping just beyond vision. Every whisper, soft at first, had grown into a deafening chorus, repeating names, memories, and secrets with chilling accuracy. One man pressed his hands to his ears, muttering, "They know everything, every thought. They can see us, hear us, even our fears we've never spoken." His companion clutched his arm, trembling. "It's alive. It's alive," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the piano's relentless notes and the distant hum of the ship. In cabins, terror had become personal. Mirrors reflected distorted, twisted versions of passengers, faces elongated, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in silent screams. Beds shifted subtly, drawers opened and slammed shut, cold patches pressed against skin, leaving deep, icy bruises. Dreams and reality had merged. Waking offered no relief. One woman tried to speak to a friend. "Did you see it? In the mirror?" Her friend nodded, tears running down his face. I saw myself, but not really me. Something else. Watching. Waiting." On the pool deck, the water had turned into a hall of living reflections. Figures emerged, children, crew members, passengers long gone. Their eyes stared hollowly, mouths moving in silent pleas or accusatory cries. Ripples formed spontaneously, concentric circles expanding outward as if the ocean itself was aware. A passenger reached toward a figure, only for it to vanish instantly, leaving the chilling certainty of unseen observation. Dining halls had become theaters of dread. Shadows twisted beneath chandeliers, growing, multiplying, and pooling. Chairs and tables shifted subtly. Silverware arranged itself into cryptic symbols. Whispers recounted sins, secrets, and memories, growing louder with each rising heartbeat. Attempts at reassurance fell flat, crushed under the weight of the vessel's omnipresent consciousness. The grand ballroom remained the epicenter of terror. The piano's notes vibrated through every wall, floor, and bone, resonating with accumulated despair. Shadows twisted into grotesque human-like forms, dissolving into smoke, reforming elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted private memories, and invented sins yet to be committed. Hallways folded, doors vanished, staircases stretched infinitely. Every effort to flee only brought passengers deeper into the living nightmare. The bridge had become an extension of the ship's consciousness. Instruments failed. Compasses spun. Radar detected phantom vessels. Radios emitted distorted cries. Figures moved silently across decks, dissolving into mist. Every tool, once meant to guide and protect, now served to amplify terror, reminding the crew and passengers alike that the vessel controlled all. Attempts to document the horrors were futile. Cameras corrupted, footage distorted, phones recorded only shadows and contorted faces. Time fractured, minutes stretched into hours, hours collapsed into seconds. Reality became fluid and unreliable. The passengers whispered to each other, voices, trembling, "It's eternal. And it's everywhere, there's no escape." The ocean itself mirrored the ship's malevolence. Its black mirror-like surface shimmered with impossible reflections. Drowned passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and visions of horrors yet to come. The wind carried cries and whispers, blending with the piano's haunting melody, into a symphony of eternal terror. And the passengers understood the horrifying truth. The cruise had never been about leisure or adventure. It had been a sentient predator, immortal, omnipotent, and insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every heartbeat, glance, and terrified thought was woven into its consciousness. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was deliberate. Escape was impossible. Time, meaningless. Death offered no release. The vessel sailed silently across the endless Black Sea, stars above indifferent, carrying fear, despair, and memory forever. Those aboard were woven into its eternal nightmare, trapped in a continuous, seamless horror. Minds were fraying completely. Fear had taken on a physical form, pressing against chests, gripping lungs, crawling along spines. Hallways no longer obeyed logic. They folded, looped, and stretched unpredictably. Shadows moved independently, creeping, twisting, and elongating with purpose. Every whisper, once subtle, had grown into a cacophony of names, secrets, and memories, each repeated with precise cruelty. A young man muttered, voice barely audible, "They know. Everything." Every thought, every fear. They can see us. Inside our heads. His companion shook, eyes wide. It's alive. It's alive, she whispered, trembling. Cabins had become personal prisons. Mirrors no longer reflected reality. They reflected twisted doubles, faces elongated, eyes hollow, mouths frozen mid-scream. Beds shifted slightly, drawers opened and slammed, cold patches pressed against, skin leaving deep, icy impressions. Dreams and reality had merged. No waking moment offered safety. On the pool deck, figures emerged from the water, children, long-lost crew, vanished passengers. Their eyes were hollow, mouths moving silently, ripples forming on the water's surface with no breeze. Passengers reached toward the apparitions only for them to dissolve instantly, leaving a lingering chill of observation. Dining halls were theaters of dread. Shadows pooled beneath chandeliers, twisting and multiplying. Chairs and tables shifted, silverware rearranged into incomprehensible patterns. Whispers recounted intimate secrets and sins, growing louder as panic spread. Attempts at reassurance failed under the vessel's omnipresent consciousness. The grand ballroom pulsed with living terror. The piano played endlessly, each note vibrating through walls, floors, and bones, carrying the accumulated despair of everyone aboard. Shadows twisted into grotesque forms, dissolving into smoke and reforming elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recounted private memories, and invented sins yet to come. Hallways folded, doors vanished, staircases stretched infinitely, drawing passengers ever deeper into the nightmare. The bridge betrayed the crew entirely. Instruments failed, compasses spun, radar detected phantom vessels, radios emitted distorted cries. Figures glided silently across decks, dissolving into mist when approached. The ship's systems, once tools of navigation, had become instruments of psychological torment, amplifying fear at every turn. Attempts to communicate externally were futile. Cameras corrupted, footage distorted, time fractured, minutes expanded into hours, hours collapsed into seconds. Reality became unreliable. Passengers whispered, voices trembling, "It's eternal." And everywhere, "It sees us. There's no escape." The ocean reflected the ship's malevolence. Black mirror-like waters shimmered with impossible visions, drowned passengers, tragedies that never occurred, and horrors yet to come. The wind carried faint cries, blending with the piano's haunting melody into a symphony of unending terror. The passengers realized the horrifying truth. The cruise was never about leisure or adventure. It was a sentient predator, immortal, omnipotent, insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every heartbeat, glance, and terrified thought was woven into its consciousness. Every shadow, whisper, and flicker of light was deliberate. Escape was impossible. Time meaningless. Death offered no release. The vessel sailed silently across the endless Black Sea, indifferent stars overhead, carrying fear, despair, and memory forever. Those aboard were woven into its eternal nightmare, trapped in a seamless, continuous horror. The passengers had reached a point where every heartbeat seemed amplified, every breath weighed heavy, and the air itself felt like a living entity pressing against skin and lungs. Hallways twisted unnaturally, folding in on themselves, looping endlessly. Shadows stretched along the walls, moving independently, detaching from their sources to creep silently behind, beside, or even above the passengers. One trembling man whispered to his companion, "They're everywhere. I can feel them, watching me from every corner, every reflection." His companion shook, eyes wide with terror. "It's alive. The ship. It knows us. It knows everything." Cabins became theaters of personal terror. Mirrors reflected distorted versions of passengers, elongated faces, hollow eyes, mouths frozen mid-scream. Beds shifted subtly, drawers opened and slammed, and cold, icy patches pressed against skin, leaving deep bruises that burned. Every attempt to sleep was futile. Dreams merged with waking reality, ensuring that terror was omnipresent. One woman whispered to her friend, voice shaking, "Did you see it? In the mirror? It wasn't me. Something else? Watching? Waiting?" Her friend nodded, swallowing hard, unable to speak. On the pool deck, the water had become a reflection of impossibility. Figures emerged. Children with hollow eyes, long-lost crew, vanished passengers. Their mouths moved silently, ripples forming across the water with no breeze. One man reached toward a figure. It dissolved instantly, leaving a lingering chill deep in his chest, a stark reminder of the ship's awareness. In the dining halls, shadows pooled beneath chandeliers, twisting grotesquely. Tables and chairs moved on their own, silverware rearranged into cryptic, ominous patterns. Faint whispers recounted sins, secrets, and intimate memories, growing louder as panic spread. One crew member attempted to calm diners. "Everyone, stay calm. It's just shadows. It's just your mind." The shadows ignored logic. They twisted, multiplied, fed on fear, reinforcing the impossibility of safety. The grand ballroom had become the heart of the nightmare. The piano played relentlessly, each note vibrating through walls, floors, and bones, resonating with the accumulated despair of every soul aboard. Shadows twisted into grotesque, semi-human forms, dissolving into smoke and reforming elsewhere. Voices whispered names, recalled intimate memories, and spoke confessions never made aloud. Hallways outside folded, doors vanished, staircases stretched infinitely. Every attempt to flee only drew passengers deeper into the labyrinth. Even the IA bridge was no sanctuary. Instruments malfunctioned. Compasses spun violently. Radar displayed phantom vessels, and radios emitted distorted cries and fragmented voices. Figures glided silently across decks, dissolving into mist when approached. Every tool, once a symbol of control, now served to amplify fear, reminding all that the ship's consciousness ruled completely. Attempts to document the horrors were futile. Cameras and phones corrupted, footage distorted, displaying only shadows, twisted faces, and impossible reflections. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into seconds. Reality itself had become unreliable. Passengers whispered in despair, "It's eternal." And everywhere, it sees us. There's no escape. The ocean mirrored the vessel's malevolence. Its black, mirror-like surface shimmered with impossible visions. Drowned passengers, tragedies that had never occurred, and horrors yet to unfold. The wind carried faint cries, blending with the piano's haunting melody into a symphony of unending terror. Passengers began breaking down, voices cracking under the weight of inescapable fear. One man shouted into the darkened hallway, "Why, us? Why are we trapped in this nightmare?" A woman nearby whispered to no one, tears streaming, "It's taking everything. Our memories, our sanity, everything we were." The horrifying realization struck every survivor. The cruise had never been about leisure, adventure, or exploration. It had always been a sentient predator, immortal, omnipotent, insatiable, feeding on fear, despair, and memory. Every heartbeat, every glance, every terrified thought became woven into the ship's consciousness. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of light was deliberate. Escape was impossible. Time, meaningless. Death offered no release.